Let's talk about some of the current problems that the state faces and that will require legislation. Like, you mentioned the budget. Education is taking a big cut. Is there something we can do to avoid that?
Well, education has been the champion of everybody that's been running. We've always, we're going to do this for education. Many times to the detriment of the budget, simply because we were doing things and throwing money at things to such an extent in Georgia, the administrative side is way out of balance in relation to the teaching side. And that's why we've concentrated in the last 6 years of saying, the proportion has to get back to the dollars have to be in the classroom. And I've had, as you know, in what we did this year, we said that the school board can decide, here's your budget, and we're not going to dictate to you how you do it. If you have to make, in your particular school system, larger classrooms, that's your call. What we've done is made it possible for each school system to have a freer hand on how they operate within the dollars that they have. Is that going to get better? Not for a few years, I don't think so. I had some legislation this year that designated money to the school system, that is to the Hope Scholarship and to the University of Georgia's vet school and ag school. And that legislation was the horse racing. That legislation, I believe, will pass next year, this next session. I think we had the votes, but there were so many important issues out there that the leadership felt, we can't do that this year. And all I really wanted to do was to put it on the ballot. That is, because you have to change the state constitution to allow for pari-mutuel wagering. And I wanted wagering, and it specifically says in the legislation, for horses, not dogs, because they create jobs. Horses are very labor intensive. It will give the farmers an opportunity to grow crops. We'll have breeding in Georgia. When you realize that horses in Kentucky, just the horse portion, not the tourism portion, the horse portion is worth somewhere above $4 billion, and it's worth between 80 and 100,000 jobs. That's monumental. I mean, we talk about getting 30 jobs. In the morning paper, it was talking about this wonderful thing. We were going to get 30 jobs. We're talking about the opportunity to raise revenues and do it not with your money and my money, but with private money. Because the government doesn't go in and build the tracks, and it becomes, a true industry. Now, we began to wonder. I had hearings last November, and all the disciplines were notified. And I found that there are about 34 horse disciplines in Georgia. Everything from thoroughbreds to quarter horses to trail horses to mules to, everything. And people, they have their little thing that they like, and that's fine. This would help all of them, because the focus would be on what they're doing. And if you go out and look at the Conyers facility, they have over about 200 events a year out there, and that place is paid for.
That's the Olympic.
The old Olympic facility. And they have about 1,400 acres. Whoever builds the track, wherever they build it, they're going to need about 200 acres. They're going to spend somewhere between $100 and $200 million. It's going to take about 1,500 construction people. I mean, when you begin to look at all this and realize that the Churchill Downs of the world were paying attention to what I was doing from the beginning. And that's the beauty of today. When you talk about changes, in the old days, we didn't have computers. And we had the ashtrays on the desk. And we had a steno pool upstairs that would sit there and type and use carbon papers, and the steno pool was monstrous because they had all this legislation they had to type up. By today, you'd say that's so archaic. Well, that's all we had. I think it was even before whiteout at the time. I don't know. You had to tear it apart and put it back together, or start over. Today, because of computers, things are done quickly. The Legislative Counsel's office, they don't sit down at a typewriter, they sit down at the computer. They can change a bill, they print them out. It's done. Now, what's happened is it's allowed us to reduce the number of people involved in that portion of government. But by the same token, what it's done is it's allowed us the freedom to be more interactive, not only within our own state, but all the states in the country. There are people in every state that sit there and pay attention to what's going on in other states legislatively. And you can go to every state's website and type in a subject, and it'll give you all the legislation. And if you're interested, you can pull up their bills and read them and print them out and do whatever you need to do. So what's so exciting about it today is that we really are on top of things. But I started to tell you about this issue of knowing how many horses were passing through Georgia, as an issue. Okay, this money's going this way and this money's going that way. Well, I thought it was about 20,000 horses a year would pass through Georgia. So I went over to the agricultural commissioner, because he kept saying to me at a few of these receptions down at the depot, he'd say, Harry, what can I do to help you? And I'd say, well, I'll find something for you. And finally I thought, we don't keep track of it. Georgia has no idea. But Florida does. So I went over to see him one day and I said, would you call the Commissioner of Agriculture in Florida and see if he can give us those numbers? And he did. And he immediately said, because he was on the speakerphone, immediately said, yeah, I'll be happy to help. Strangely enough, about a week later, we got the figures. And for the 14 months through the end of this February, the number of horses passing in and out of Florida was 177,000. And if they stop in Georgia for anything, it's for gas and lunch. And we know that the folks in Florida, the farms, the breeding, they're anxious to move into South Georgia. And the reason they are is because Florida doesn't have an income tax, but they have property taxes, and you got to make up for it some way. And their property taxes are terrible. And they would be happy to move their efforts across the border into Georgia. But what we've got to do is we've got to be horse friendly, and we're not. Not at all.
So you think your bill will pass next year?
I think it will. I'll introduce it again. Churchill Downs is still interested in what we're doing.
Are they in favor of it?
Yes, big time. Yeah. Well, when you look at Churchill Downs, don't just think of Churchill Downs. Think of, there's two major groups that own the tracks in the United States. And Churchill Downs is one of them. They own Arlington Park in Chicago and others that I know they do. I'm not aware of which ones. And then you have Frank Stronach of Magma. And in fact, Frank Stronach, a number of years ago, came to Georgia, and he's made his money over the years in the auto parts business. And he offered to, if we would have horse racing and let him build a track. And he wanted to bring 4 of his plants here. He said they had to be close to the interstates. And he went straight to the top. He went to the governor at the time and said, look, we'll end up spending $1 billion here in Georgia. And the governor at the time said no. So he turned to the left. These are different times. They're hard times. The people are looking for some hope, revenue, jobs, opportunities. You know, it always amazes me when people say, well, I'm all right, but our unemployment is above 10%. Those people aren't paying taxes. So our revenues with the state are down. In fact, the people that are still working are not spending as much for fear that, you know, that may be me someday. So what we've got to do is we've got to change the attitude. We've got to look at the big picture. Several things are important to our future. We don't have the Rawson Havertys and the Ivan Allens that we once had in Atlanta. And they had great sway over the community. And MARTA and all the rest of it came out of their efforts. But water and transportation and in the improvement of our school systems are three big things that we've got to continually concentrate on. And we've got to look at the big picture. We've got to quit worrying about what does my constituent down the road think totally and say, well, I'm going to act on his idea only because all he's thinking about is few square acres. We've got to think about the whole state and its future. And you know, if we don't have water, we're in bad trouble. And we keep growing. In the last 10 years, we've grown by close to 2 million people. And I think the census will, in fact, we should pick up 1, possibly 2 more congressional seats. We have 13 now, we should be at 15. And of course, we have reapportionment coming up this year. We will have 2 sessions next year. We'll have the normal session, and we'll do the reapportionment during the summer. And I guess in late summer, we'll come back and have a quick session to pass the reapportionment.
What do you think of 4-year terms for members of the House of Representatives?
Well, I've always been in favor. In fact, I think, because I don't remember all of it, I think I even put a bill in once to make the Senate 4-year terms and the House 2. And because I've been a big believer, and at one time I even flirted with the idea of limited terms. The states that have done that have found it's a disaster. And the reason it's a disaster, they might have 6 or 8-year limited terms. The people that are running those states are the staff, not the elected officials. And that's the last thing you want. Now, you rely heavily on your staffs, but they are not the decision makers and shouldn't be. The people have elected you to make a decision, and if it's wrong, by golly, they'll replace you quickly. And you know, and everybody keeps that in mind.
Speaking of reapportionment, I believe you helped introduce a bill to create a commission on reapportionment rather than the way it's done today.
I did. You're talking about the one that we introduced this year to create the commission. I did. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere. But the idea is that we would give another group an opportunity, that is citizens, an opportunity to look at how they think. It didn't mean that we had to accept what they did, but it would put them out there on the front line. And there was provisions in there to reject it and have us rewrite it if we had to. But it would allow some new thinking. You know, one thing that we as legislators understand, we don't have all the answers. We don't even have staff that has all the answers. There's a lot of people out there with great ideas, and we have to rely on using as many folks as we possibly can, and that's what that was all about.
Immigration, big issue in Georgia.
Well, it's a big issue in the nation, more so in some areas than others. And it isn't so much immigration because we're all basically from immigrant ancestors. It's about illegal immigration. And, you know, they keep flirting with the idea that we need to put the fence up, and they put portions of it up, and we keep seeing pictures of them climbing over the fence. And basically, it seems to be drug-related more than, because a lot of the folks that were here in Georgia, as an example, returned to Mexico. In fact, I understand that one of the problems they have when they go back is that the kids that they've had while they were here are not speaking Spanish in some cases, and they're having trouble in school because they can't speak Spanish. Well, we've had that reverse situation for years, where they come in, spoke only Spanish or other languages, and it made it difficult for us, and it made, it's more expensive to train somebody that doesn't speak the language than it is to train somebody that speaks the language or teach them.
Georgia has passed an illegal immigrant bill that is on the books now.
Yes. In fact, at the time that we passed it, which was 5 years ago, I think, maybe been 6 now, it was the toughest illegal immigration bill in the country. And it didn't get the hype and whatever that's going on in Arizona today. And yet Arizona's bill, I don't think it's that much more stricter than ours. And in fact, they've laid it out so that you can't go out and just stop anybody on the street and say, show me that you're a U.S. citizen. In fact, other than our driver's licenses, what are you carrying that shows you're a U.S. citizen? My passport's locked up in the safe at home.
I'd like to go back to 2005, following the 2004 election.
Yes.
When the Republican Party took over the Georgia House of Representatives, which gave them control of the entire General Assembly.
Yes.
How was that transition?
You mean as far as Republican Democrat is concerned?
Taking over the General Assembly from the Democrats.
Well, it worked pretty smoothly. In fact, it worked smoother than I thought it would. Some of the Democrats resented it, but I've been on both sides of the aisle as far as serving in the majority and minority. And the majority is a lot more fun. You have a tendency of knowing what's going on sooner. But there are no more necessarily perks for the majority than there are for the minority, because there's not many perks out there anymore. Our whole ethics law has made it very, very strict about what you can and can't do. Now, to what extent? Somebody wanted us to be able to say, well, a lobbyist can't spend more than $5 on you. You can't buy a cup of coffee today at Starbucks for $5. I mean, it's not doable. So you can't go and jump off the bridge just to say, gee, we went from, when we took over 6 years ago, we went from 48th in ethics legislation as the strictest to 7th. That's a big jump. I mean, we're at the top of the heap right now. There was some effort to bring legislation, ethics legislation up, and we did. We passed some, but it didn't go as far as some people wanted it to go.
Should we try to strengthen it?
If we find that there are areas that it needs strengthening, but probably not. Abuses will occur, and usually in most cases when an abuse occurs, they're caught up with. We've had declaration of what's being spent, both from the lobbyist viewpoint, and what we did is tighten that up this time, as well as the candidate. I mean, we have to file, and the beauty of it is today is you file online. Everything's online. And the moment you file, the world can look at it. I mean, in the old days, it wasn't like that. Nobody knew what was going on. Today, they know everything that's going on. And sometimes I feel like They're complaining simply because they don't have anything to complain about. You know, let's make it tougher. Well, how tough do you want to make it?
Harry, there's political unrest in the country, as you know. What do you think about this Tea Party movement?
I've attended two of the Tea Parties at the Capitol. The first one that I attended, I was amazed. I couldn't believe how many people were there. And as far as the eye could see, they ran all the way from the Capitol down those side streets to Fulton County Courthouse. And they ran all the way over on Georgia State on one side and all the way over to whatever those state buildings are, a couple of blocks over. I was just amazed. They had planned on this. They realized that they were going to have that kind of crowd. So they had screens up with, you know, with sound so that they could accommodate all those people. Because I asked the local police and the Capitol Police, the only person that was rowdy and got out of hand was somebody on the backside of the Capitol that was back there trying to create havoc. And finally they just had to hustle them off. But that was the only one. There were no nasty signs. There was not the things that, you know, you're going to be told, oh, these people are terrible. They're not terrible. Great many of them are Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites.
Right. Which brings me to my next question. How do you think this movement is going to affect the individual parties, Democrat and Republican?
I think it's going to make them more responsive to their constituents. I really do. And when I say constituents, I'm not worried about which party as much as I am about the fact that, you know, there is a whole group of people out there that are saying, you're not performing, so you're going to have to go. And the Republicans, I think, have learned that. The Democrats are making, in my opinion, some terrible mistakes in D.C. in their attitude and outlook on how things are going. Now, they get heady when they get in D.C. You know, somebody said, why don't you go for higher office and go to D.C.? I said, well, first, I think I can do more good down here. Secondly, I think that the economy will survive only because of the states. And states like Georgia, who still have a triple A bond rating, are doing it because we pay attention to what we're doing. Yes, it's going to be painful, but it's got to be done. We don't have printing presses to run. So it's going to be beneficial to both parties. And as both parties are finding out, you know, even in the primaries, some of the incumbents are finding that they're having some hard times this year because they have not either been responsive to their constituents or they've been on the wrong side of some issues that their constituents are concerned about. And which is healthy.
Harry, have we forgotten anything?
Oh, we've forgotten a lot, but you know, it's one of the things I wanted to mention to you was back in the old days, the poorer days for the Republican Party, when we were just beginning to make motions, which would have been back in the Nixon days. What we would do when we had an inauguration is we would go down to Callaway Gardens and we would have and this was in the days when Paul Coverdale was playing, you remember the Farkle family? They were on television.
Oh, yes.
The comedy group.
Yeah.
Well, we'd do skits, and Bob Shaw and I would do the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In show. And we'd go down a day early and we'd write all this out. And of course, it pertained to the elections and everything else. And we'd do a comedy show the next night at the banquet, at the dinner. And of course, we couldn't afford to go to the inauguration because it was very expensive and you had to go to D.C. But we could afford to go to Callaway Gardens. And that place, we'd fill it up. It was wonderful. And that was, that was a lot of the camaraderie was the basis for the Republican Party that caused it to build. Today, it's, as I find, there are so many people out there that have no idea whose shoulders they're standing on. And it's sad, but that's life.
Looking back over your career, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment?
I'm not sure I've accomplished the greatest thing yet. I have 2 bills coming up that I'm going to reintroduce. One's the horse racing, which I think would be a great accomplishment for the state. Secondly is another bill that I had all the way over into the Senate, had good support for it. We ran out of time, so to speak. But what it does, because we have been taxing, and I had a high-ranking state employee yesterday mention to me about how some people are stealing money from the state. And it's one of the things that we have found that is occurring. But what the bill did and will do is it will remove all sales tax from all sales of vehicles and remove your birthday tax, your ad valorem tax, totally. And of course the sales tax is 7%. And have a one-time ad valorem tax, title tax. We've removed the ad valorem tax. One-time title tax at the time of the purchase of 6 3/4%. Now your first thought is, wait a minute, that math doesn't add up. Well, it does, because in Georgia, casual sales, if I sell you my car or I buy yours, there is no sales tax. But you pay a birthday tax the rest of your, as long as you own that car. What's interesting about that is in the few states that are left that do it this way, about 32, 34% of the sales are casual sales. Strangely, in 1969, in 2009, 2009, the sales in Georgia were 62%. It was close to 1 million sales that didn't pay any tax. Well, what we found, and the Revenue Department says they don't have enough employees to go after it, is that some people in the industry are selling cars without a license to sell. And if you sell over 5 cars, you've got to have a license. And that's loss of revenue to the local community. But secondly, is that when you talk about over 900,000 cars not paying any sales tax, all of a sudden, if they just pay a one-time title fee, you will recapture, and it's basically a revenue neutral process. And it had strong support. It had the head of the Motor Vehicles Committee work on it all this past summer, and the head of Ways and Means working on it. And unfortunately, it died in the Senate, even though many of the folks over there were supporting it strongly.
Never came to a vote.
Wouldn't let it on the floor. Wouldn't let. In fact, I passed it out of the year before. I passed it out of the committee, out of the Finance Committee in the Senate, without a dissenting vote, and couldn't get it across the floor on the last night.
Looking back over that same career, what has been your biggest disappointment?
I try not to do that. And the reason I say that is because if you think about the disappointments, I can tell you some business transactions that I should have gotten involved in that I didn't, that were extremely successful. And you know, you look back on it and you say, well, gee, you should be upset. Why? I made the wrong judgment politically, and you have to do that when you get involved in politics. As much as you know that what you're doing is right, it may not make it. It's like the horse racing. It should have been on this year's ballot. It will be next year. You know, I think we've got them all lined up now. But it would have saved the state of Georgia and the citizens of Georgia 2 years. And because we can't put it back on the ballot for 2 years. So what I'm going to try and do is go ahead and get both the enabling legislation passed and the constitutional amendment this coming session, and then it'll just sit there on the books for a year and then go on the ballot in 12. And you know, that's sad as far as I'm concerned in regards to the people of Georgia, because here was an opportunity. I had a doctor call me about 3 days before the end of the session from South Carolina, and he said, is your bill going to pass? And I said, I don't think so. And I said, why do you ask? And he says, well, I breed horses. And he says, I'm tired of dragging my horses up and down the interstate to Kentucky and South Florida. And he says, I would love to have tracks in Georgia. And he said, I would go back to breeding. He says, I'm going to quit breeding. Now, this is somebody out of state, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't end up benefiting from his efforts. Because what you do is you have what they call, in this case, Georgia bred. Now, his would be South Carolina bred. I'm sure what he would do is come over to Georgia and find somebody would do the breeding and take them back to Aiken, South Carolina, and let them go through their pregnancy, and then bring them back to Georgia to let them deliver. It's still money in our pockets here in Georgia. There's just so many opportunities like that. And that whole cycle takes, because if you want to have a Georgia bred horse, and we don't breed that many in Georgia, your cycle is 3 years. Gestation is 11 months and 4 days. After that colt is born, you're not going to run it for 2.5 years. Well, it's about the time that if we were able to pass that this year, because I know people that said, I'll start breeding horses now, so that when the track is up and ready to go, I've got a Georgia bred horse. And which is critical. You know, you end up winning more money that way. That's what it's all about. But it's money in the pockets of the people in Georgia. It's taxes to the state. And when you realize the billions of dollars that are involved in these auctions, you go to Keeneland, where they have the horse auctions twice a year. The jets fly in from all over the world. Is Georgia getting anybody come in from wherever? No. We're just not thinking about the big picture. And you know,
Well, the people passed the lottery.
they did, and how many people have jobs because of that?
Many.
Well, not that many. 30 people up in
Oh, you're speaking of the
physical, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sad part of that is it's preying on those people that think they're going to get rich. I haven't played the lottery in probably a year. I take that back. About 6 months ago I did.
That was for the big jackpot.
No, it actually wasn't. It was a strange thing. I was out of town, and my cab number, my limousine taking me to the airport, was the same number as the tail number on my airplane. And I called my daughter and said, buy me this number. So she bought me 5 of them. Nothing happened. But no, what it's worth to Georgia, as far as horses are concerned, is in the beginning is between 10 and 20,000 jobs. In Kentucky, it's 80 to 100,000 jobs. Why should we pass this up? Did you realize we have 250,000 horses in Georgia today? It's a big industry. And people love their horses.
Harry, when our great-grandchildren go over to the Russell Library to research Harry Geisinger, how would you want to be remembered?
Hadn't thought about that. Because
As the man who passed the horse racing bill?
Well, that wouldn't hurt. But as somebody who has helped the future of Georgia. The legislation for the water in the Tennessee River, the boundary dispute, I introduced it in the House. David Schaefer introduced an identical bill in the Senate. And the only reason that we used his bill is because he had a harder time getting it out of the Senate than I had getting it out of the House. I had 133 votes for that. And what it simply said, and the governor signed it, what it simply said is that the governor will take and sit down with the governor of Tennessee and the governor of North Carolina. Now what's interesting is North Carolina never said a word about this. Tennessee, they were beating their breast about it because they know that where the mistake really is, the big part of the mistake, is up there at Nickajack, just west of Chattanooga. The line is 1.1 miles too far south. And if you go back to all of everything that's ever been said since the creation of the state of Georgia, and Georgia at one time ran all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but very shortly ran just to the Mississippi River. And part of the agreement to give up the land to our west was that when they put the line in, it would run from the western bank of the Chattahoochee River at West Point to the northern bank of the Tennessee River at Nickajack. Well, when it was surveyed in 1818, because the settlers were beginning to settle up there and nobody knew where the line really was, they put it in the wrong place, and we're not sure whether they put it where they did because the river at the time was flooding, or they were worried about the Cherokee Indians who were not happy with the settlers that were up there, and they didn't want to have harm come to themselves. So they just said, this is a good place to put it, and that's where they put it. But they missed it by 1.1 miles. Because with GPS today, and I did this, the Japanese public television came over and said, would you do, and I said, sure. So what I did is I took a handheld TomTom and went up there, and of course, it'll tell you exactly where you are. And I went to the mark when they photographed all this. Went to the mark, and it was 1.1 miles off. But we went around. Now, because we didn't have a boat, we couldn't get into the river, but we went all the way to the 35th parallel north. And you can look due east, and you can see where the mark belongs. In fact, you can go on Google latitude and longitude and do it today and see exactly where that mark belongs. And it's right there in the middle of that lake. So the dispute, and the reason that was all done was for the water rights. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the line, in those days, they did two things for boundary lines. They used rivers, and they used north and south and east and west. Well, this doesn't go north and south. If you look at the line, it goes to the west, to Nickajack. If you look at a Georgia State road map, you'll see that the 35th parallel is up here, the line is down here, and it goes all the way, and when it gets over to Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, It's at the 35th parallel. And it's just the piece of pie keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes over. None of that has been ratified by the states or the United States Congress, and that's what it has to be. So it's still sitting there saying 35th parallel. That's what this issue is all about. It's water. We don't necessarily need those people. It's about 56 square miles. Most of it's national forest. We don't care. But what is important is for the future of this state is we should have adequate water. And that is very critical. And without that water, and there is 24 billion gallons a day passing through Nickajack. That's a lot of water. And when they designed the Tenn-Tom River in Alabama, Tenn-Tom waterway, Tennessee Tombigbee, when they designed that, it was designed to have 8 billion gallons a day flow through it. That's how much they were assigned. They're only using about 2 billion gallons. And because they don't have any traffic. I mean, you know, they spent billions of dollars to build that thing for Tom Bevel, who was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the through the 80s in the Georgia House, I mean the United States House. It was his boondoggle. They're not using it like they should.
Well, Harry, it's been a great pleasure
It's been my pleasure.
to have you here, and I want to thank you on behalf of Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia for being our guest.
Bob, thank you much, and don't hesitate to sit and chat again.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.